I would like to welcome you all to this IPW lecture. My name is Henrik. I'm Professor of International Politics and the Environment here at the Department of Political Science. And I have the honor to welcome our guests, Professor Noelle Selin and Professor Henrik Selin, and our discussant, Professor Patrick Müller, to this lecture. We have this opportunity because Noelle and Henrik are currently based at Munich University for a sabbatical, writing their new book. They will present a chapter out of this book. I will briefly present them and then hand over. So Professor Henrik Selin is Professor of International Relations in the Frederick S. Hardy School of Global Studies at Boston University, as well as an Associate Director at the Boston University Institute for Global Sustainability. And Professor Noelle Selin is an atmospheric chemist and professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the Institute for Data, Systems and Society and the Department of Earth, Atmospheric and Planetary Sciences. She is also director of the Center for Sustainability, its Science and Strategy. They co-authored a book that is also quite relevant for today. It's called Mercury Stories: Understanding Sustainability Through a Volatile Element, Global and Governance of Hazardous Chemicals, Challenges of Multi-Level Management, published in MIT Press. Today, they will present a chapter from their new book. After their presentation, I asked Professor Patrick Müller, who is a professor here at the department and also the Diplomatic Academy of Sciences, to discuss the chapter, and we will then open the discussion, and you are all kindly invited to ask your questions. Thank you very much for coming, and I would like to hand over and ask you for the presentation. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for for inviting us and having us present here today. So this is very much a presentation of a book project as opposed to a book, as it is a work in progress. So what we're presenting here is a draft chapter or draft analysis. So we're very much looking forward to comments and thoughts, because we're still working through some of the things here. So we welcome your thoughts and comments later. So we are interested in treaty effectiveness. And sometimes we hear that the Montreal Protocol and efforts to address stratospheric ozone depletion is one of the very few successful environmental treaties there are. Equally often, if not more often, we hear what total, utter failure and disasters the climate change treaties are. Against this background, we were starting to think about but what really is treaty effectiveness? For a lot of these, they tend to focus on one singular thing, the atmospheric concentration or stratospheric concentration of ozone, or emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. But when thinking about effective means, it's more complicated than looking at just one single metric. And it also raises questions: who decides what is effective and from what perspective? And that's how we generally approach this. Now, for those of us who were in grad school in the 1990s and early 2000s, one of the things that you had to read was a lot of books on international environmental institutions, at least if that was the area that you were working on. So there was some very helpful literature here where people were starting to think about what is the definition of implementation of a treaty? What is the definition of compliance? And what is the definition of effective and effectiveness? And different analysts came up with different definition of effectiveness, and then they took their definition of effectiveness and tried to apply it on a number of treaties. There's also a more recent chapter in the IPCC, Pat et al., that did the similar thing for climate change treaties. But for the earlier literature, one of the problems that they had, there was not a lot of empirical material to actually draw from, because there were not a lot of global environmental treaties in the 1990s that had been around for a particularly long period of time, which made it difficult to say whether it's effective, right? Because you need a certain amount of time to think about effectiveness. And also, different analysts came up with their own definition and applied their own definition. So there were sort of varying definitions of effectiveness. One thing that's then happened over the last 25 years is that a growing number of environmental agreements have been subject to treaty effectiveness evaluation by the parties themselves. And this is then where we're coming in. So the purpose of this project is not for us to say whether a treaty is effective or not, but to look at how parties have carried out effectiveness evaluations, how they have made those determinations, and compare and contrast, and then sort of look at, for a lack of better phrase, the effectiveness of effectiveness evaluations, right? So it's sort of a standard political science international relations. You have 4 cases, analyze the cases, compare across the cases, draw conclusions, right? So we're looking at 4 cases of treaties on hazardous substances. So we're looking at the Vienna Convention and Montreal Protocol on ozone. We are looking at the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants, and that's the chapter that we're going to focus on here. We are looking at the Minamata Convention on mercury, and we are looking at the Framework Convention on climate change and the Paris Agreement. And here, these are all treaties on hazardous substances, pollutants. That means that there is some commonality, but they're also different enough that you can actually compare. So we elected to not focus on biodiversity or trade in endangered species. We want to have a set of treaties that are similar enough in the types of issues that they focus on that it makes sense to look across them. So just a brief background to sort of understanding the practice of treaty effectiveness evaluation, because that's really what we're looking at here, right? Not the theory of effectiveness evaluation, but the practice, how they are being carried out by the parties in practice. So parties are part of these treaties, and as such, they have both some shared and individual interests, right? So for POPs, they do have a shared interest in mitigating the environmental and human health problems from persistent organic pollutants. Otherwise, they wouldn't be a party to the treaty, right? But they might then also have individual interest when it comes to particular chemicals or financing or capacity building or information sharing. So they are really sitting there at the table with a combination of shared and individual interests. And they're really using these effectiveness evaluation as a collective learning and accountability mechanism. So what do we mean by that? So one thing to do in effectiveness evaluation is to learn whether the treaty is actually effective or not, right? Are the things that we're doing working or not, right? There's a learning component to it. But there's also inherent an accountability mechanism, right? We have agreed to do things. We have set up objectives. We have set up provisions. Are we actually meeting those objectives? Are we meeting those provisions? Are we actually doing what we set out to do? And all of these effectiveness evaluations are then focusing on the collective progress. Like our collective implementation mechanisms, are they enough, right? This is not about pointing fingers at individual countries. We are not evaluating the contributions of China or the contributions of the European Union or the contributions of the United States, right? They are very much set up to collectively rather than as a mechanism for where you identify and punish particular countries. And all of these effectiveness evaluations are also explicitly designed to inform future decision making, right? So we want to learn about effectiveness, we want to help us stand accountable, but then they're also designed to explicitly say we're then going to take lessons from these evaluations and feed it into continuing treaty implementation, hopefully making better decisions or better treaties in the future. So these are very much political processes. I don't have to say that here. We're sort of trying to do this for an interdisciplinary group. I'm coming from social sciences, we are from the natural sciences. When we do this to a group of natural scientists, you really have to hammer home the point that this is not a technical exercise. This is politics, 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 right? I don't have to do this in this room. I'm just going to skip that right over. But one of the things that we're then looking at, that they are designed in various ways, right? So the effectiveness evaluations for these 4 treaties are not carbon copies of each other. They are structured in different ways, they use different indicators, they use different sources of information. And that's the sort of comparative analysis that we want to get to. How are parties actually doing this? Rather than having sort of a more philosophical question about what is an effective treaty, is to look more at the nitty-gritty of the practice. So we have an overall research question, as one should have. And do treaty effectiveness evaluations help improve international environmental governance, right? So we have treaties, they're supposed to contribute to global environmental governance, right? So if we then have effectiveness evaluations, do they actually help to contribute to better treaties, contributing to better international environmental governance? And in doing that, we are then breaking down this practice of effectiveness evaluation into 3 components: a what, and a how, and a who, right? So what have the treaty parties set out to assess through the collective effectiveness evaluation? Okay. What is it that they are evaluating? And then how is, okay, once they have agreed on what it is that they want to evaluate, how are they actually doing it? What's the process for doing that? And then the who, as I said, they're sitting at the table with shared and individual interests. So if we're looking at what they are evaluating and how they're evaluating it, which interests are actually reflected in that, and how does that impact future decision making? Now, if you want to do a comparative analysis, you better have some kind of coherent analytical framework. So we're going to present what we have sketched out today. And it's sort of a 4-stage framework focused on agreement, translation, attribution, and reformulation. So the first one is agreement. I'm not sure why that is blurry.
Yeah, it wasn't last time.
It's not supposed to be blurry, sorry about that. So the first one is agreement. That's reaching agreement around the agreement in the first place, the treaty. The translation is then to identify specific indicators that are used for an effectiveness evaluation. Attribution is then gathering information using those indicators to carry out an effectiveness evaluation. And then the 4th step is reformulation, is to use that evaluation to feed into future decision making, as in reformulation to the treaty text. So today we're going to focus on the Stockholm Convention and persistent organic pollutants. As many treaties that we're looking at, sort of pollution oriented, there is sort of, one can sort of look at it as sort of a conceptual chain, as in humans, for their activities, we produce POPs, we use POPs, we trade in POPs, we result in POPs waste, right? As a result of all of these activities, these POPs are released into the environment. They cycle in the environment, so there are POP concentration in air, in soil, and in water. There's bioaccumulation, it ends up in food webs, and then at the end of the chain, there are risks and impacts to human health and the environment for POPs. So the Stockholm Convention is explicitly designed to cover this entire conceptual chain. So that was one of the first things that they agreed on. And right now, 185 countries, plus the European Union, are parties to the Stockholm Convention. So there's 193 EU members, that mean 193 UN members, obviously, and 185 of those are parties to the Stockholm Convention. The one ginormous non-party is the United States. So it's basically the United States and a number of fairly smaller countries that are not parties. But I think we can still talk about this very much as a global treaty. It's very much global in scope. So I'm going to talk about the 2 first steps here, and then I'm going to hand over to Noelle to talk about the other 2 steps, and then some general insights. So the first one is agreement, right? How treaty objectives and provisions reflect consensus among the negotiating countries who subsequently became parties. So here again, we have that conceptual chain. And then we can see that in the Stockholm Convention, there are what we refer to as control provisions. Those are the ones that bans production, bans use, controls things in one way or another. But all environmental treaties also have enabling provisions. Those are the things that our parties are required to do that help them fulfill their control provisions. So that is about national reporting, it's about information sharing, capacity building, financial support, all of those kinds of things. So a convention is a kind of combination of control provisions and enabling provisions. And these are then attached to different parts of this conceptual chain. So the overall objective is to protect human health and the environment from POPs. Here, some countries were thinking more about the long-range transport, because one of the things that makes this a global treaty is that these pesticides generally stay in the atmosphere long enough that they can cycle on more or less of a global scale, or at least a hemispheric scale. So you can have a chemical that is used in Morocco, and then 6 months later, you can detect it in the polar bear in Greenland, right? So there's long-range transport. But then there's also local management concerns. A number of these POPs or pesticides that are used locally in the world and then have local problem, like Rachel Cosman told us already in the 1960s. So again, the provisions focus on the entire life cycle here. And then we started the treaty with 12 POPs. So when it was adopted in 2001 and then entered into force in 2004, there were 12 chemicals controlled under the treaty, listed in various annexes. At that time, there was sort of a general consensus, this is a good starting point. There was no one that really pushing to add anything else. But it was also clear that these 12 were not going to be enough, right? So we created a mechanism for adding additional POPs to the 12. So there's, it's set up with, we're going to control these 12 for the various life cycles, and then we have a mechanism for adding. And then, as I said, also a number of enabling provisions. One of the things that the parties did not do, that it clearly says in the treaty text, there should be a compliance mechanism. It took them 20 years to actually establish a compliance mechanism because they couldn't agree on that. But since 2 years, we actually have a compliance mechanism as well. So that's the first, right? So sort of sketch out what is the treaty, how is it set up, what are the enabling provisions, control provisions, what did the parties agree on actually doing. Then, in the Stockholm Convention, there is also an explicit treaty mandate to carry out effectiveness evaluation. So in that sense, this is not something that the parties discovered that they were going to do later. Already when they negotiated the text, they said there should be an article in there that says we have to do periodic effectiveness evaluations. So it's not something that they thought about like an afterthought. It was very much baked into the establishment of the treaty. There should be an effectiveness evaluation. It should start 4 years after entering into force. So entered into force in 2004, so that means it takes us like 2008, 2009. So the initial effectiveness evaluation ended in 2009, and then there was one that ended in 2017 and one that ended in 2023. So we have initiated 3 rounds of effectiveness evaluation, because that's another thing I should have said up front. The idea here is not to do a one-shot effectiveness evaluation, it's to do effectiveness evaluation on a rolling basis, because treaties evolve over time, right? And then in addition to the overall effectiveness evaluation, there is also reviews of the financial mechanisms, which is predominantly the Global Environment Facility. So we're doing the treaty as a whole, and then a separate for the financing mechanism by itself. There have been 5 of those reviews to date, again, on a rolling basis. The translation. This is, okay, we now have an objective, we now have various provisions, we want to measure whether we are doing effective implementation or not. So the way that they've done that is that they have identified specific indicators, and then they have attached those indicators to either the objective or the various treaty articles. So it's sort of a very structured approach to doing effectiveness evaluation. So for the first evaluation, the Secretariat, the parties were not quite sure what they were doing, so they said to the Secretariat, hey, come up with, propose some indicators, which they did. So they had 4 overall indicators. You have them there, reduction in monthly POPs and so forth, right? So that those were sort of overall. So that gives you some idea of what an indicator would look like, right? But then, in addition to these 4, they then come up with 30 others in total that were then attached. So there were, for Article 2, there were a couple. For Article 4, there were a couple. For Article 5, there were like so forth. And these then importantly covers both the control provisions and the enabling provisions. This one, though, never materialized, because one of the things that they did not do is that at that time, the parties had not agreed on an evaluation framework. So when the Secretariat produced the report and the proposed indicators, the parties said, well, we haven't agreed to how actually do the evaluation. We haven't actually agreed to the indicators either. So thank you very much for your efforts, but we are not able to actually conclude it because there's no political agreement on what we're actually going to do with all of this information. So it ended in a little bit of a nothing burger there. But hey, one thing you should do from an effectiveness evaluation is learn, right? So in that sense, they did learn. And they did learn that the parties need to be much more heavily involved in this to get political buy-in, right? It's politics, 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 right? And if it's politics, 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 you need to get political buy-in. So for the other two, it was the COP that negotiated and agreed on the indicators. Okay? So part of the negotiation was how many indicators should we have, which articles should they be attached to, and how should they be formulated. So for the one that ended in 27, we had 46 process indicator and 11 outcome indicators. So we had a total of 57 indicators that were then divvied up across 13 areas of control provision and enabling provisions. We also agreed on a framework for doing the evaluation. I'm also going to get that next step. And then for the more recent one, the one that ended in 23, it was a similar process, right? Where the COP, again, negotiated indicators. But again, there's actually some learning because the indicators are not the same. They just didn't do a carbon copy of the second for the third. They actually thought about which indicator worked, which indicators didn't work, why, so we can tweak it, right? So they come up with a slightly tweaked list of indicators that they thought was going to be better for the one that ended in 2023. Where we now had gone from 57 to 41 indicators, right? So one lesson is more indicators is not always bad, right? You need to have indicators that actually allow you to do an effectiveness evaluation. Sometimes more is not better. And here, we're then also looking at 16 areas. So we have a smaller number of indicators, but we have a larger number of treaty areas that are covered by this. And I'm going to hand it over to Noelle now. She's going to talk about what the heck they're doing with all of these indicators.
Great. So, thanks. Yeah, so now you've got these indicators, you've got this agreement. Now, did the treaty actually do anything? So first of all, you need to actually get the data for these indicators. And the Article 16 in the convention actually identifies very specifically where you can get data to do an effectiveness evaluation. One is, monitoring in the environment. Another is reporting that's mandated by the convention. And the third is this compliance mechanism, but note that we didn't agree on that until 2023. So that didn't provide much of the data for the 2009, 2017, and 2023 effectiveness evaluations. But what was really sort of obvious right away is that there wasn't a lot of data on these chemicals in the environment. The initial 12 had a decent amount of data. These are chemicals like DDT or PCBs that were monitored in the atmosphere and in biota. And there was a good number of measurements, but mostly in northern countries, a lot in the Arctic, not much at all in Africa, not much in South America. Only parts of Asia were covered. And that made it really difficult to evaluate what's happening in the environment because you didn't have a global picture. So the COP actually adopted a global monitoring plan, and they decided on a regional approach to data collection, dividing into the 5 UN regions to try to shore up that, that data availability so that the COP could then have a way to understand what's happening in the environment. And that global monitoring plan, again, some of that monitoring is supported by the financial mechanism, produced 3 different reports, and that's one of the key environmental indicators. Now, attribution is actually kind of hard, because what you have to do is you have to think about sort of what's happening in the environment, and then how that translates into tracing that back to what provisions, controls as part of the treaty. So you have something like, okay, so you've monitored concentrations of persistent organic pollutants in a polar bear. And well, lots of polar bears are very different. You've got big polar bears, little polar bears, they eat different things, they live in different places. And so you have to figure out sort of, okay, do you have enough data to actually characterize trends over time? And then can you trace sort of where those chemicals came from all the way back to the controls, bans on substances, right? Now, to do that in a rigorous scientific way, depending on how you frame the problem, it can be almost impossible. So what the parties did was they kind of made a few key simplifications. They said, well, we think that all else being equal, that if use of these substances, production of these substances, emissions of these substances go down, then we're going to be overall better off. Now, climate change also messes up the signal of what's happening in the polar bears. Lots of changes are affecting the polar bear, not just the chemicals. But they made that simplification in the way they designed the framework in the attribution step. The other important simplification that they made was that any changes in production or banning substances, they said, well, that is a result of the treaty, right? That either there's this question of would countries have banned things in the absence of an international treaty? We're not going to deal with that in assessing effectiveness. We're going to make the assumption in our effectiveness evaluation that the treaty, either pushed it along and happened earlier or wouldn't have happened in the absence of a treaty. They don't do that in a sort of, economic way or a sort of quantitative way. So all of those assumptions were in the 2017 and 2023 effectiveness evaluations, including the third one, which is that implementation will protect humans and the environment, again, getting to that final conclusion there. And so what did they actually conclude? Well, in 2017, they set up this politically representative group to actually do that attribution step. So there were nominees from each of the different regions, and they went through and they looked at the input from the Global Monitoring Plan. The science input from the Global Monitoring Plan wasn't asked to do this attribution step. It was just asked to provide monitoring data. Although they did a little bit of it, they kind of, interpreted a little bit of what the trends were on the environment and talked about attribution a little bit, but that was kind of a little bit beyond their mandate. It's the mandate of the political group to actually do that evaluation. They said, well, we think that this overall is an effective and dynamic framework, and noted that in most cases for those initial 12, which we're calling the legacy POPs, that monitoring data showed clear decreasing trends. And again, with their assumption that, the causal chain, the decreasing trends were the result of actions, you say, we think this is a sign of it. Similar conclusions were in the 2023, so I don't quote it here, but there were some more mixed results with some of the POPs that they added to the treaty, because they just didn't have enough monitoring data to say whether they were going up or down. So kind of jury's still out on those. And there were also important data gaps. And remember, I talked about sort of the monitoring data and the ability to fill in those data gaps through the global monitoring plan. Well, the other source of data gaps is, the national reports. So how many parties have banned substances? How many parties have reported production? And the reporting is actually at a fairly low level for the Stockholm Convention. So there isn't really sufficient information on some of these process indicators either that come from that national reporting. Finally, in terms of financing, the reviews of the financial mechanism also identified a key gap between available funds and what's needed to support implementation. And that has not actually been addressed. And when I say addressed, so the idea is that parties would then use insights from these effectiveness evaluations to adjust objectives and provisions. Now, one of the major ways that the Stockholm Convention has been modified is this addition of substances. So there's 24 new chemicals. The COP has amended the treaty during every single conference of parties between 2009 and 2025. They've added some substances, some of these have been politically controversial, but this kind of reformulation of the treaty has not really been influenced by the effectiveness evaluation. Well, why is that? And that is that the effectiveness evaluation is constrained to look at the POPs that are either proposed for addition or already on the treaty. The scientists, the global monitoring plan, doesn't have the scope to look at what are the potential other persistent organic pollutants in the environment that might be leading to environmental risk. That's not part of that effectiveness evaluation, right? So the problem is defined in a very sort of constrained way. The other way that things have been could have been reformulated is also through reviews of the financial mechanism, and donor countries have not increased funding through the Global Environment Facility in the POPs area as a result of the gaps that were identified. So we see sort of limited reformulation. There's a lot of reformulation going on, but not so much in response to effectiveness evaluations. All right, so returning to our 3 questions, the what, how, and who. I'm going to talk about the Stockholm Convention, and then I'm going to open it up and talk about some of the lessons that are emerging from our other cases that I'm not going to talk about in so much detail. So on the what have the treaty parties set out to assess through effectiveness evaluations? Well, it's that whole life cycle approach. So it's the control provisions, the enabling provisions, it's not only the concentrations in the environment and core media like the air and in biota, but it's also production. So really thinking about that whole conceptual chain and trying to trace different provisions addressing different steps of that. And that's not sort of inherent in the in necessarily the POPs issue. You could think about alternate effectiveness evaluations that just looked at sort of human exposure, but it's really reflecting this consensus that is inherent in the Stockholm Convention, where some parties are really prioritizing long-range transport and impacts, and other parties are thinking about, are we using the Stockholm Convention to assist in our chemicals management, contaminated sites, ability to regulate near-term hazards from these substances. And because of that, the sort of what that they're assessing is this hybrid and needs to be sort of across that life cycle. The structure in the Stockholm Convention is very formal. There is something that's called the effectiveness evaluation. As of the second round, the Conference of Parties have approved and elected the members of the Effectiveness Evaluation Committee, designed the framework, designed how that framework is incorporated into recommendations, established the global monitoring plan, and structured the scientific body such that the global monitoring plan reports directly to the COP, which is, as we'll see when we go to some of the other cases, slightly different in other agreements. Okay, so interests. It was really important that this was a politically representative process. The indicators were negotiated by the COP. The evaluation was carried out by a committee that was representative of the regions. Right? They didn't go off and tell scientists, tell us whether this is effective. Right? That happens in other agreements, but it didn't happen here. The COP kept that as a political judgment and kept it sort of close to its own mandate. On the other hand, the evaluation of the financial mechanism was done by an independent evaluator. So the sort of scientific, the collection of data for POPs in the environment, very close sort of surveillance of that scientific process. On the financial mechanism, they hired a consultant, and the idea was that that's completely independent. So those two things were both feeding into the effectiveness evaluation. We can talk a little bit of the discussion about that kind of duality of evaluating financial mechanisms through sort of established independence and how that's different from a scientific evaluation. Because there's no sort of key reason why that has to be the case. All right, so that's for the Stockholm Convention. So I'll go through some of the preliminary comparative conclusions, with a little bit of a risk here because I haven't talked about the basics of the case, but talk about how these different cases vary across these elements of what the treaty parties have set out to assess, how they're structured and carried out, and whose interests are reflected. And I'm just going to highlight a few of the kind of themes that are emerging across some of our cases. And so we showed this for POPs, this conceptual chain from production all the way to risk impacts to human health and the environment. And we've colored in the fact that risk and impacts is the objective of the POPs treaty. The Mercury Treaty really follows that very closely. Risk and impacts to human health and the environment is also the objective, and it's a whole life cycle treaty. But our other two cases end up being very different in terms of where the objective of the treaty is on this conceptual chain. In ozone, yes, it's about impacts and risk to society, but it has an explicit objective of eliminating ozone depleting substances. So it simultaneously is looking here and here. On the other hand, climate has changed over time. So with the earlier mitigation emissions of greenhouse gases with the Kyoto Protocol and the Framework Convention, focused on sort of keeping atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases at a safe level, right? So avoiding dangerous interference in the climate system. There's goals on emissions, but the Paris Agreement has morphed into a focus on temperature change, also on adaptation, and also on financing. So this triple goal of the Paris Agreement also involves one component of the process, not just the outcomes. And so there's a real difference in the focus of the objectives, which in turn influence the evaluations. So whether the evaluations focus on upstream or downstream kind of approaches, are you evaluating whether you're emitting any ozone depleting substances, or are you trying to assess the impacts of UV changes and climate effects? One thing is notable that the ozone case never really evaluated changes here. Mostly did its evaluation kind of more up here. And that variation in the focus of control and enabling provisions is important. There's also a degree of how subjective are the metrics. Protecting human health and the environment, right? Have you protected enough? Pretty easy to say whether you've eliminated a substance. Is there still, you've got data that it's being produced. Guess what? It isn't eliminated. It doesn't take a lot of policy judgment. But if human health is sufficiently protected, is a judgment call. So these treaties vary across those. All right. On how, one of the most important things of institutional structure is that in the ozone treaties, most of these mechanisms, the scientific groups, are reporting to the Conference of Parties. And that's the case for the scientific assessment panels, but it's also the case for the financial mechanism. In the POPs case, that's the case for the the scientific groups, but not the financial mechanism, which is the Global Environment Facility, which does not respond to the report to the Stockholm Convention. In climate, it's a little bit even more of a constellation. There are some scientific groups, like the Subsidiary Body on Scientific and Technical Advice, that do report, that are permanent subsidiary bodies reporting to the COP and the meeting of the parties. But there's also, I pulled this from one of the UN Framework Convention documents, there's also the IPCC kind of sitting there in its own little oval on the side, the financial mechanism sitting in another oval on the side. So institutionally, there's not that sort of common reporting mechanism. And that really affects the effectiveness evaluations because you get into a situation where the Conference of Parties doesn't have the opportunity to sort of come to consensus with scientific advice that it is directly receiving in that institutional framework. All right. And so whose interests are reflected and how have effectiveness evaluations affected policymaking and treaty implementation? I'm highlighting climate and ozone here, right? Pretty much to bookmark the tale of two treaties. This comes from one of the Global Stocktakes technical dialogue and talks about, norms of discussion and expert panels and how all of that kind of messy world of negotiations is trying to get at who might be able to make these kinds of judgments and on what. So one of the things that's really sort of up for negotiation as part of the stocktake is to what extent can you point a finger at different parties for actually fulfilling their objectives or not. It's designed to be collective, but there's elements of parties still sort of saying, well, have you done sufficient work? And the scientific input into that are a bunch of different expert panels that sort of collect. This is a picture from the last ozone negotiation, which just happened a couple of weeks ago. And I thought this was really illustrative because it really is a much different model of experts sort of interacting with the Conference of Parties. Small number of experts in general, mostly sitting in rooms with parties, sort of discussing one-to-one and answering questions about the technical sort of ways in which the provisions under discussion would actually manifest in the environment. So that sort of, and in the ozone case, we see that scientists were really given authority to make collective attributional and effective judgments through these scientific advisory panels. They're one of the questions and answers that comes out every 4 years as part of the Montreal Protocol assessment is the Montreal Protocol effective? And the scientists answer that question and present it, and that gets accepted by them. So you see a very different kind of way in which the science community is working together with the policy community. So one of the things that we don't want to do is say, everything is a matter of effectiveness evaluation, right? A lot of the political debates and discussions that have happened, in these different core issues, and climate is a particular example, effectiveness evaluation won't help if countries really aren't aligned on their goals and if there's a lot of contestation. But what we're seeing is that effectiveness evaluation can really help in those, in learning and in accountability to keep processes on track. And that's really how the global stocktake was designed. It's how ozone kind of kept renegotiating itself and really tracked and ratcheted up over time. And we think these processes really offer an important insight into how parties can collectively sort of negotiate together on what they're doing and potentially why they're staying at the table.